more than 59 plus toxics were found in carpet waste.
Especially young children are very susceptible and very vulnerable.
I think there was just an assumption that it would be safe to do this.
Hello and welcome to the Plastic Health Channel. In this series, we're going to be sharing with you new evidence of the effects plastics have on our health, and especially the health of our children, because plastic is everywhere. But it's not just plastic. We're also interested in what's added to these plastics and what these often toxic ingredients are doing to our bodies.
Does plastic make us sick?
Are we okay? I think we will be. But we're not right now.
Not maybe just for our health, but for the future of our children.
Today, we're talking about plastics outside in sports and play areas. Under the pretense of a circular economy, huge amounts of plastics are being dumped in places where they shouldn't be, such as children's playgrounds, which basically makes them toxic playgrounds. Later on, we'll be discussing the health hazards of artificial playing fields. But first of all, something that's gone largely unnoticed until now, the link between plastics in carpets and horse riding.
Europe's carpet industry is growing, with the Netherlands, Belgium and the UK producing 65% of the total. The problem? It's circularity, or rather, the lack of it. Europe generates 1.6 million tons of carpet waste per year, but because of its complex composition, only 1 to 3% can be reused. Carpets are often made from plastic, and the majority contain dangerous chemical additives. So where does this carpet waste go? Part of it ends up in horse riding arenas where children learn to ride. On average, a single arena contains 2,400 kilograms of synthetic fibre. But with horses moving about, people coming and going, or a breeze blowing, what happens when these fibres are released?
With me is Laura Hoogenraad. Hi Laura,
Hi.
Thanks for being here today. Now, as an investigative journalist, you discovered that horse riding arenas are filled with plastic fibres, right?
Yeah, it's like a synthetic fiber. So, well, you can imagine that shredded carpet is a nice bouncy surface for horses to ride on. It prevents injuries and that kind of stuff. But the most important characteristic of these fibers is that they can soak up lots of liquid. So this keeps the ground nice and moist, but not too wet. It doesn't create puddles. So it creates a nice surface to ride on, like in all weather conditions all year round.
But we just heard about, was it 2,400 kilograms of these synthetic fibres end up in a typical horse riding arena? Does it stay there, or do they have to be refilled from time to time?
It depends on the riding arena. Some top it up every few years because it disperses in the wind, or it's in the natural environment, or it goes with the manure out of the riding arena. But of course they choose synthetic fiber because they want it to stay in there. Synthetic fiber doesn't naturally decompose, so it can stay up in there for like a decade or even longer.
Now these are the fibres. These are the some old ones. You got some new ones there. These have been used.
You got the used ones.
Yeah. But we have to wear gloves to handle them. But you can see they're very crumbly. They sort of disintegrate. A lot of sort of this kind of dust coming off of them.
Yeah.
I mean, does this dust just disappear then? Where does it go?
This is the problem. So the larger fibers are not so much the problem, because when we inhale them, we'll probably cough them up, or they'll leave our body through our stool. But the smaller, the tiny ones that you see, if we just do this, it's like hundreds of tiny fibers are coming off. And these can go into our bodies like very deep into our lungs, and they can penetrate your membrane in your lung and intestines. And that's where it gets tricky, because these fibers can enter your blood circulation and start accumulating at some points in your body. And that's where it gets, well, I talked to a professor, his name is Dick Vettek, and he told me that the problem is that these fibers have also chemicals in them, and carpet is of course very toxic, or there are chemicals in there because we want it to be flame retardant, we want it to be dust repellent, but these are also impossible to get rid of. So when we shred carpet and use it in equestrian surface, these chemicals come with it as well.
Right, and you mentioned that they can be quite harmful to our health.
Yeah. Well, there's not the biggest problem here is that there's just not a lot of research in this field, but it is harmful for health because in carpet, a recent study showed that more than 59 plus toxics were found in carpet waste that was sold in the EU. So that's a lot, and all of these chemicals they can cause asthma, they can cause developmental disorders, reproductive disorders, even cancer. So we don't want this to end up in our lungs or in our bodies.
Surely
even
not.
Even if the effects are not like that known, it's not good news.
Yeah, it stands to reason. You wouldn't want to get them inside you.
Exactly.
So, what struck you most about your research findings?
Well, of course, the biggest question is how are we condoning that this stuff ends up in our horse riding arenas where children, staff, and people are at work always. We first need to know whether it's healthy and safe to use, and only then can we go on and actually use this stuff instead of the other way around, what we're doing now.
Well, Laura, thank you so much for sharing your findings with us. But what do the young horse riders and their parents think about this?
This is one of the boxes where you ride horses.
Yes.
Did you know that in the sand in the horse box they use flakes like these, and sometimes these flakes are made of recycled carpets? Did you know about that?
No, I knew like that they were in here, but I never really knew the exact purpose of it.
No, I didn't know that.
Yes, I know. Yes, I know. I know that because I arranged it.
What do you think about that?
Well, because it's recycled, I think like, okay, that's good.
I think it's amazing.
Recycling is good, but what if I tell you that if you ride in a horse box that uses carpet fibers, microfibers can be released, which you could possibly breathe in. And by doing so, you may breathe in dangerous substances that can cause health issues such as diabetes and developmental issues.
I didn't know that.
You didn't know that? What do you think about that?
That's changed my mind.
No, I didn't know about that. I also thought it was safe.
Yes, it sounds dangerous.
In that case, I don't think it would be a good idea.
But this is new information. It shocks me a little bit.
Do you think that people who make these flakes should inform people about this is what's inside the horse box?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think there should be more information anyway.
I think it would be nice to be informed about this kind of stuff, so you can make your own decision about it.
To many horse riding schools, these synthetic fibres might seem like an environmentally friendly choice, but the risks are unknown. Let's talk a little bit more about these health hazards. With me today is Majorie van Duursen, Professor of Toxicology from the Vrije University. Hello, Professor van Duursen. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
We just heard about harmful chemicals being added to carpets and then ending up in horse riding arenas. But in what ways are these chemicals harmful to our health?
Well, there are many ways that these chemicals can be harmful. So some of them can cause hormone disruption. Some can cause neurodevelopmental problems. Some are carcinogens. Some are suspected carcinogens. Some can affect your immune system. And we know that especially young children are very susceptible and very vulnerable for these effects. So
that's quite a list.
Yeah, it is.
But why are these chemicals added to carpets in the first place?
Well, they're added to the carpet for a variety of reasons. Mm-hmm. So to prevent fires, to make them water and stain repellent, also to make them more flexible. So there are very different reasons why these chemicals are added.
Mm-hmm. But if they're so harmful, surely there's regulation to protect us.
There is regulation for chemicals, and some are regulated, some are even banned for use in the European Union. But the thing is, there are also loopholes. So that means that phthalates, for example, that are used to make these more flexible, they're banned in Europe. They cannot be in your children's toys, for example, but they can be used in recycled PVC. So in that way, they can be used in the carpets. So it's not in your children's toy, but your child can play on a carpet that contains these chemicals.
So it's a bit of a loophole, really.
Definitely.
Right. But do we know whether these chemicals actually do enter our bodies?
Yes, we do. We can measure them in urine, in blood, or even deeper in your body, in organs, in placenta, but also amniotic fluids. But we don't really know where they came from. So we don't really know which product causes the exposure to these types of chemicals.
Okay, so you can't say for sure if they're coming from the carpets in horse riding arenas, for example.
No, but they're definitely also part of a contribution.
But what about possible dust formations of microplastics. Is that a problem as well?
Well, that's a more difficult question, actually, because we know that in dust are fibers and microplastics, and you can inhale them, and they come into your respiratory system and your lungs. They can cause irritation there. And for the very tiny parts of plastic, they probably can also enter your body and cause effects there. But we don't really know how that works. We don't really know what kind of effects we should expect. So that's a more complicated question that definitely needs more studies.
Okay. And I'm watering to reduce the dust formations in horse riding arenas, for example. Does that help?
Well, it can help reduce the dust and the inhalation of these particles, definitely. But it won't prevent the chemicals that you will get on your hands if you touch it. So it's part of the problem, maybe. That's a part of the solution.
Okay, just part of it. Now, this recycling of carpets for horse riding arenas is presented as a good thing, giving products a second life for a more sustainable future. But that's not the whole story, is it?
Well, no. Unfortunately, that also means that chemicals that we actually want to get rid of and that we know are harmful and we want to remove them from the products are being recycled and used into other products. So we keep circulating them, and that's, I think, not really what we want.
No, not at all. A lot of food for thought there. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us. Now, later on, we'll be discussing this with two members of the European Parliament, and I'll be asking them what they plan to do about this and why this is legal in the first place. But for now, though, it's not uncommon to find waste on children's playgrounds, but also on artificial playing fields. In fact, there was a lot of public concern about this a couple of years ago. But do we really know if they're safe now?
Artificial sports fields and kids' playgrounds are known for their soft feel. That's because of the crumb rubber made from recycled car tyres, which is used as infill material. The US and the EU each have 13,000 large turf fields filled with crumb rubber, most commonly used for football or hockey. On average, 20,000 car tyres are needed to fill a single field, and up to 50% of the infill material disappears each year. So where do these crumbs disappear to? Are they toxic? And what does that mean for the health of our children playing on these fields?
Joining us now from Scotland is Professor Andrew Watterson from the University of Stirling, who's a researcher on public health and toxins. Good afternoon, Professor. Thanks for being here.
Good afternoon.
Now, we just learned that the rubber is used on sports fields and playgrounds. Do these crumbs and rubber tiles have toxic substances in them?
There are a lot of substances that may be hazardous in natural and synthetic rubber. Both those things may be in crumb rubber and tiles. So there are plasticizers, fillers, pigments that colour the rubber, various metals that may be used, and a whole range of additives and contaminants. A study last year found, looking at 300 substances, but a whole series of them were hazardous, and something like 50 odd were known to be suspect or known cancer-causing substances. There could also be things that interfere with the hormone system, endocrine disruptors. It could be things that affect you neurologically. It could be things that affect development. So these are the hazards that are there.
Right. Well, you say could be. I mean, and several large studies have been done. Yet there still seems to be some debate about whether it's safe for our children to play on these fields and in these playgrounds. Do you personally think it's safe?
I don't think anybody can say that it's certainly safe because of what we know about some of those hazardous effects to development and so on. What we have seen recently are attempts by the regulators, RIVM, the European Chemicals Agency, and in the US, various agencies trying to establish from models and predictions what might be safe. And they say there are very big safety margins put in. Can't say absolutely things will be safe. They say there are very big safety margins being put in. But if you look at the situation in Europe, you would find there's a much tougher standard for these chemicals in toys for children, tougher standard for these chemicals in consumer goods. But in crumb rubber, in sports fields and on playing fields, it's standard is much looser. So it doesn't necessarily reflect the public health arguments. That looser standard probably reflects the economic arguments and social arguments.
So, Professor, can you say with any certainty if it's safe for children to play on these fields?
I think there's a very big debate going on, and that's about what is safe and what is acceptable. And we need to distinguish the two things. So probably a lot of people from a public health point of view would want to know that things are safe, whereas the sort of regulatory system, the control system, is one that says things are or are not acceptable. And what's been happening is standards have been getting a lot tougher recently, and we've gone down from having parts per million of a substance being hazardous to parts per billion to parts per trillion. So we actually need to know what the risks are of crumb rubber.
But if the health risks are unclear, then why are car tyres recycled for the use in sports pitches and playgrounds in the first place? Isn't public health our primary concern?
Public health should be the primary concern, but because we have some evidence one way and some another, the conclusion's been drawn, well, everything should be okay. You can't do that because the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. You can get toxic effects in terms of cocktails. You could get issues that affect children and not adults. It's very, very complicated, but the public health default position should be, if in doubt, don't.
Do you know if there are any alternatives to the use of crumb rubber that would be better?
There are alternatives. They've been floated for some time. There's cork has been used as an infill. They've used coir from coconut. And my particular favourite is natural grass, which has been around a long time and has been well assessed, and we know doesn't have the sort of toxicity that might exist in crumb rubber.
So why was crumb rubber created in the first place, if we do have these alternatives?
Well, we have rubber tyres, and there was no consideration that we'd break these tyres up and stick them on sports pitches originally. But we do have the problem about what do we do with those tyres. So if you can have a circular economy and you can recycle the tyres and make them as tyres again, that's a good thing. But if you end up with a substance in pitches and paths that could, in fact, one, affect the people who use those pitches and paths, and two, also affect the public and indeed the wider environment from pollution, that's not a very good thing. So that's where you would adopt the precautionary principle. We should be putting the burden of proof back on to manufacturers and government, and they should be the ones who are there to protect vulnerable populations. Now, they would probably say we're doing that with the reuse of these substances, but the more we learn, the more uncertain the picture comes across the span of usage.
Right. But was there any research done beforehand to investigate the potential risks before these crumb rubbers were implemented on playing fields?
Absolutely not in that form. I think then people may have argued, well, there was no problem making rubber tyres, but in fact there was, and the tyre workers suffered all sorts of diseases. I think there was just an assumption that it would be safe to do this. Wasn't properly thought out, wasn't properly assessed, no life cycle analysis. So in those sorts of contexts, even if risks are small and the public health benefits aren't significant, why do it?
Well, Professor Watterson, thank you very much for sharing your research with us. Now, our roving reporter George went to a children's playground.
We're on a playground here. We have black tiles over there.
Yes.
Did you know that they are possibly made of recycled car tires?
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it makes sense. Looks like that, yeah.
Yes, I did.
No, I didn't know that, but that's awesome.
I did not know that.
And what do you think about that?
If it's recycled, it usually means good, right?
Sounds good, right?
Yeah.
Would you still think it's a good idea if I tell you that some substances in car tires have been related to dangerous, hazardous goods that have been related to health issues such as carcinogenic issues like cancer or hormone disruptive issues? Did you know about that?
No.
I did not know that, no.
No, only in bottles, like the PET.
Yes, I'm a chemist, so I know all about it. And that is definitely a whole problem of the whole plastic industry.
And with that knowledge, how do you look at the tiles now? Do you think it's safe?
Good question.
Young children, such as my daughter, play here, and touch it and everything. So no, I don't think it's the best thing then.
You never know when you see the plastics. So you really always have to zoom in the production of something to actually know whether something is healthy or hazardous.
So I think it's good that discussion is being raised.
You trust that people will inform you if there are hazardous substances in it?
They should, yes, they should. And I think it's the responsibility of the government, first of all.
But if low substances are dangerous and hazardous for health, then I would expect that the city council do something about it.
So it seems our children's health is worth risking in order to deal with the enormous amounts of waste we create. But why is it acceptable to let our children play in places if we don't know if they're safe? Let's ask two members of the European Parliament, namely Eleonora and Francisco Guerreiro. Thank you both for taking the time to talk to us today. Now, we've just been talking about two examples of dumping plastic waste when we're not sure what the risks are to our children. I presume you're both aware of the use of crumb rubber, but were you also aware of the use of plastics in horse riding arenas? Miss Avey first.
Well, honestly, I am aware of the risk we are running on a number of substances, chemical substances present in plastic. But honestly, I count on the safety of these specific use in playgrounds, even because back in 2017, the ECA declared these artificial turf and so also the recycled rubber used in it to be safe. Apparently today we discover it is not. So that's something 3 years later, we discover new evidences that pose bigger questions on how we protect the safety of our children over there.
Mr. Guerreiro, were you aware there's also plastic fibres in horse riding arenas?
Yes, and as my colleague said, this is a new finding which begs the question: what science is being held in these institutions regarding, for example, as my colleague said, ECA, the European Chemicals Agency. So, what data is being used to analyze these chemicals? I have a huge issue due to the international trade because European Union has high standards of analyzing this data and the products that arrive, but other countries that we trade with don't have the same standards.
Were you aware of the health risks of these plastics in the horse riding arenas in particular?
Yes.
Yeah. These dust formations that have been...
Well, not in particular, but we are aware, and more data is coming out that there's a lot of danger regarding plastics and their chemicals being disposed in the environment. That is unfortunately a huge reality. But I would also like to state that some of this data is also very conditioned by the studies that are being influenced by some big corporations. So we should have a more independent analysis of this data and more studies. So the EU funding should also be striving to have more independent studies on the issue.
Indeed. But as we know, governments have an obligation to protect our health. It's known as the precautionary principle. I'm sure you're aware of that. But that doesn't seem to apply here, does it? So what can the European Union do to ensure it's safe for our children to play on these recreational facilities?
Well, precautionary principles should guide all the decisions that we take at the European level, at the national level. Unfortunately, too often we see that this is a wonderful principle not really applied in reality. So this is something we have to be aware of and open our eyes and try to stress as much as possible that this should really be the way forward. So in terms of concrete actions that should have been and should be made by member states and by the European Commission, as also my colleague were saying, these studies and that must be independent. And I also would like to add that too often we we focus on single substances instead of analyzing the mixture of substances. Especially, we know this in pesticide regulation, and this is something that now we discover the same approach should be applied also in plastics and all the recycling plastics that we are facing today. As might be risky for the health. So
Absolutely.
This is one of the elements I would like to recommend the European Commission and member states to take a look on.
Is that something you're going to bring up then?
For sure.
Okay, great. But shouldn't manufacturers build circularity into their products in the first place so we don't have to deal with all this toxic waste? Surely that's a better way of looking at things. And is there something you can do about that?
Well, the European Parliament, I'll jump in. The European Parliament is now debating the Green Deal, and so it has also launched a strategy to the industry that reinforces the importance of the circular economy. But for us, because we are two members of the Green family, for us we are been saying this for more than 40 years. So this is our paradigm that the economic model should not be apart from nature, from health, from protecting the citizens, and also to have robust companies that can deliver what they promise. And so it has to have more regulation, more fiscalization at the member states, and I think it's always very important to note that our trade deals are also very important, because we can be making a huge effort here in Europe, but if we make a trade deal, for example, we are in the heads of making a huge fiscal and economic trade deal with China.
Sure, but bringing it back to playing fields, I see. Francisco Guerreiro, you have pictures of some children behind you. You have children yourself?
Yeah.
Would you allow your own children to play on these playing fields with crumb rubber, for example? Do you think it's safe?
My children thankfully play in the dirt, so they are most of the time in the nature. So
that's a good place to be, playing in the dirt. Yeah. Well, I hope you really do take this up at the European Parliament level, and thank you for doing that. And I wish you a lot of luck and all the best with this important task.
Thank you very much. All the best.
Thank you.
Now, that's it for this episode. Thank you so much to all of our guests, and thank you for watching. If you care about what plastic does to our bodies, then stay updated by subscribing to the Plastic Health channel. See you next time.